If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what are some of your paranormal encounter stories? I recently went on a hike with my daughter on a little trail that is part of the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. As we hiked, I got a feeling of malice and death in the area. This sounds crazy, and I usually don't believe in paranormal things, but I felt like bad things had happened near our location, and the memories of those atrocities were still attached to the ground. I didn't say anything and tried to shake it off. Unprompted, my daughter said, "Dad, can we turn around? I feel scared for some reason and I don't know why." We turned around and the feeling subsided. When I got home, I spent some time trying to research the history of that particular area, and I couldn't find anything specific. The only information available was that a certain tribe related to the Cherokees were moved off the land and relocated somewhere out west by the US government in the 1800s. It was spooky though. This happened when I was a teenager. I was sleeping in my room with my cat. The door was closed and it was dark. I woke up and saw this shadow at the foot of my bed. It was huge, about 8 feet tall and vaguely the shape of man. It was the darkest thing I'd ever seen and just seemed evil. I laid there staring at it, too terrified to move or make a sound, when all of a sudden it collapsed into a pile of black dust and shot under my bed. I'm prone to night terrors, so hallucinations at night aren't unusual for me. But what was unusual was my cat, who normally doesn't react because I'm the only one who can see the hallucinations. But this time she looked right at it, ran to the door and furiously began crying and scratching at the door trying to get out. It was late one night during the summer. I was driving to my girlfriend's house and got lost in a nearby neighborhood due to some road work going on. I pull into a dead end in the middle of the neighborhood, and as I'm turning around I see a little bald, but kind of smooth gray creature run into a bush. I never got a good look at it. I stopped with my headlights pointed at the bush and I see 2 little red orbs light. I booked it out of there. Well, this happened to me last night. There were a couple other things that happened to me before this, but nothing quite as intense as this. I was washing the dishes after dinner. My entire family went upstairs, except one of my pugs. He was standing in front of the stairs, when he turned around, looking at me with these wild eyes. He looked scared, then he looked to face the darkest corner of the house, and began barking. Scared the shit out of me. Finished cleaning, and took the hallway, past the pantry. I looked out the window and I could have sworn I saw this extremely sickly pale figure, just staring at me for a split second. I say this because as soon as we made eye contact, the lights went out. And I'm not saying the power went out, the lights were fine. I ran back upstairs and booked it to my room. I talked to my father about that. He calls her Doña Helena. I grew up in a house that I would describe as haunted. My parents agree, but my brother doesn't. When my parents bought the house, it was in extreme disrepair and I was a baby, so I would stay with my grandma while they worked on the house. I never stepped foot in the house until it was finished. One morning, my parents walked into the house through the side door into a room that just had a dirt floor. There were baby footprints in the dirt. I regularly saw weird things in that house. The one that sticks out the most though is something my dad saw. I used to sleep in nightgowns as a little girl, and one morning around like 5 a.m. my dad saw a little girl walk into our kitchen in a nightgown. When I woke up later that morning around 8, he asked me why I was up so early that morning and why I was in the kitchen. I told him I had just woken up and he was shook. This is only one of many paranormal stories that I have, but it freaks me out the most. I have a big old military chest at the end of my bed. It's solid metal, etc. And one night I wake up to go get some water and I get the feeling I'm being watched. So I turn over and look to the end of my bed, and there standing in the middle of the chest is what appears to be a 6'6" tall shadow person just standing there watching me. I couldn't see through it as the darkness it gave off was so deep. And it felt curious and like it was confused that I was there. I decided to just go back to sleep as I didn't want to disturb it, but I later told some family members and my brother spoke up, saying he's seen it about 5 or 6 times just loitering in his room. And from where he pointed it out in his room, it's a straight shot through a wall to mine. We still have no idea what it is, but we call it Bob now and watch out for it nightly. My biological dad lives in a creepy old farmhouse he renovated. I was helping him build out the office late one night. He went to the bathroom, and I kept plunking away. I was on the floor and set my hammer down. I felt something, a presence, and looked to where I thought someone would be. Nothing. I reached back down for my hammer and it's out of arm's reach, maybe 5 feet further than where I had set it down. I hadn't moved, at all. He comes back after he's finished and I tell him what had just happened. He laughed and said, "The little girl must be playing with you." Little girl, what? He then tells me that every now and then he hears a little girl laughing, and has even seen her. She's always wearing the same pair of overalls and she just kind of wanders around upstairs. I'm not one to believe in paranormal experiences, but I have no explanation other than a little girl ghost just wanted to play. In August of 2019, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, around much of the US. Along the way, I most often preferred to wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods at night, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. After a month of this, I had grown quite accustomed to the fact that a nighttime forest is far from a quiet place. At the very least, there would always be the constant droning of thousands of crickets and toads. It didn't take much of a breeze to stir music from the trees. Perhaps I'd camp near a babbling creek. It was always the highlight of my nights, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes, and I fondly recall one night when I set up camp right between two owls who spent much of the night calling back and forth. But then there was this one night. In mid-September, I was biking through the mountains of western Montana. That day, I had been traveling through a particularly rural area. By the time the sun neared the western horizon and I began looking for a place to camp, I could hardly even remember the last time I'd seen another person or a car. I was way out there. It didn't take me long to find somewhere to set up camp. After pushing my bike into the woods, I pitched my tent and made my bed. I spent the final few minutes of sunlight journaling and planning the next day's ride, then brushed my teeth before turning out my light and laying down to go to sleep. That's when I made a disturbing realization. Outside my tent, there were no owls or coyotes, nor trickling water. There was not so much as a single cricket chirping, nor the slightest movement in the air to pull sounds out of the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees. It was dead silent. And that was terrifying. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. It felt as though the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. Suddenly the snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the cacophony of the forest, sounded like a gunshot. It was the worst night's sleep of the entire 7 months I was traveling, and when I heard the first bird call of the pre-dawn hour, it was such a huge relief. Was at a friend's apartment with another friend. Us two visitors were sitting on one side of the kitchen table looking into the living room, the friend who lived there facing us. We were just talking when I saw a large dark figure of a man, like a shadow standing on its own, walk across the living room. I immediately looked at the friend next to me and he said, "Did you ducking see that?" Which of course I did and said so. We told our friend what we saw. She got freaked out and said something like, "I can't believe this is happening again." She explained that since she was a child, people have seen something following her or often standing behind her, and it eventually happens everywhere she moves. She left that apartment shortly after. My 2-year woke up at 3 a.m., sat up in his bed, looked to the corner of his room, the bit that the camera doesn't cover, and said hi, then paused for a little while, like he was listening to someone, then said okay bye, laid back down and went back to sleep. So when I was in high school and had to go to dance team practice stupid early, my dad would get up and drive me there. I remember I was at the bottom of the steps of our dimly lit house waiting for my dad to come down. I saw the figure of a man at the top of the steps for like a second and thought it was my dad. That's when my dad said, "Are you ready to go?" And I saw him standing at the front door looking at me. Obviously I looked at the top of the steps again and it was gone. This was also around the time my aunt was visiting from a different country and had told us that she has a figure that follows her and watches her as she sleeps. Apparently she saw him at our house, in my room that she was staying in. My firstborn child and I were in the midst of a month-long battle of wills about where he should sleep. I was valiantly trying to get him to sleep in his crib. He was even more insistent he could only sleep wrapped around mama. One night I wake up around 11 or so to hear my son crying in his room. My husband is not in bed with me and I assume he is still awake. Just as I'm about to get up, I hear someone whispering over the baby monitor, saying my son's name and making the sort of soothing hushing noises one makes to a crying baby. The crying reduces to the occasional whimper, and I think, "Yay, Daddy has got this one," as I lay back down. A few minutes later the crying ramps up again, so I call to my husband to just bring me the baby. No response from husband, more crying from baby. I try again, same thing. Now I'm super annoyed that my husband is being stubborn, and clearly none of us are going back to sleep until I nurse the baby, so I get up and head to the baby's room. The second I step into the hallway I hear my husband snoring. Hess out cold in the guest room and has clearly not been shushing our son in his nursery. I snatched my now hysterical baby out of his crib and hightailed it back to my room for the night. I also unplugged the baby monitor. Of note, this was 2011 and a cheap baby monitor. It was the older radio style, not internet capable. Also, we live in a fairly spread out suburban neighborhood and had never picked up any sort of interference before. My mom died when I was a pretty young adult. I couldn't get her to answer her phone, so I went to her house to check on her and found her body. My mom's sister and I have always been very close. When she came in town for the funeral, we decided to spend the night at my mother's for a few nights to feel closer to her and be amongst her things. We were sitting in the living room with her cat. When I found her, her cat was curled around her head. She loved that cat. We were talking about her life and it got a little bit deep. We were both crying and hoping she was at peace. Suddenly the cat who was sitting between us jumped up and started hissing at the fireplace. Then the flue to the fireplace slammed shut really loud and scared the shit out of us. We then heard footsteps above us in her bedroom where she died. It was scary and not comforting for us or the cat. My mom committed suicide and had been really despondent after my dad died. She was also the kind of person who never wanted anyone to feel sorry for her. I think we got too personal about her life and pissed her off. I had several other uncomfortable moments in her house while cleaning it out. My then 8-year-old son and I were packing boxes and her bedroom door slammed shut. It was a nice day, no windows or doors open. My son looked at me and asked, "Why is Granny so sad?" My grandma came to me the night she passed too. I was in school and working, so I couldn't leave to visit her. My dad said it was okay and to focus on school. Couple of days later she came to me in my dream. She looked like she did when I was a kid and was wearing pajamas she always wore. She said she was leaving. In the dream I felt like I knew where she was going and understood. I told her I was going to miss her and she said she would too. Woke up and my buddy was giving me a ride to work and my dad calls me crying. She had passed. I told my dad my dream and he believed me. He was happy that I saw her before she left. I don't believe in ghosts, gods, or anything supernatural, but I still can't deny what happened. When I was around 7 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night because I thought I heard a loud noise in the house. I walked out of my room and glanced down the long hallway where I could see the street light shining through the window onto the kitchen floor. I rubbed my eyes and I saw what appeared to be my younger brother standing just beyond the beam of light in the shadow. I walked towards him to see what was going on, and as I got closer and closer, it became more and more clear that this small boy was not my brother at all. It was standing there super still, head tilted and just staring at me with these piercing dark eyes that I'll never ever forget. I ran straight into my parents' room as fast as I could and slept in their bed that night. I never brought it up to them and I did my best to try and forget it. I think I almost convinced myself that I made it up in my head. Fast forward several years later and I'm a senior in high school hanging with my then girlfriend, my brother and a few of his friends at our house. It was dark and storming outside and our power had just gone out. I decided to light a candle, put it in the middle of us, and we were all just laying there talking on the floor. Someone randomly suggested that we tell ghost stories and I immediately thought about my encounter 10 years prior. I said, "Guys, I'm going to tell you all something that I've never told a single soul. I saw something many years ago right here in this very house, and IDGAF if you believe me or not. I 100% saw something paranormal right over there actually." Pointing over to the kitchen. Before I could even start my story, my brother goes, "Wait a second, are you serious?" I glanced over at him confused as to why he interrupted me. He then looked me dead in the eyes, his face distressed and turning a little bit white. Did you happen to see a little boy?" My jaw dropped and I was at a complete loss for words. Everyone around us immediately started freaking out too because they instantly grasped that we had both seen the same thing. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. When I was a kid, must be like 10 to 12 or something, I had this guy, P, in my neighborhood, 4 years elder than me. We used to play together. And he would tell us these stories about how he used to see fire in certain areas of his house. And the visuals stopped when his grandfather got some holy rituals done in the house. But back then I never believed him. Few years later, we are all grown up and adults. And P's mom accidentally caught fire in the kitchen. P's elder brother tried to save her, got his hands burned in the process. No one knows how it happened. And after being in hospital for 2 to 3 days, she succumbed to her injuries. And at that time, we didn't have those childhood stories in our recollection. And then later that year, we all friends were just having a late night walk and talking about ghost stories, just joking around trying to scare each other. And P was all quiet and listening. And all of a sudden he says, "Do you remember I told you I used to see fire in my house? See how my mom died?" When I was working private security about 8 years ago, I was contracted out to a bicycle race event. I was on the night shift, meaning I was just sitting for 12 hours a night watching where they stored many of the bicycles and other event gear. Specifically, everything was stored on a little lakeside beach that the hotel owned. I guess the hotel was sponsoring the event? Not sure on the details. The beach was far from a scary or secluded place. The hotel was right up to the beach and the whole place was dimly lit. There were signs up saying that the beach was off limits after event hours. This was mostly respected by people. It was near the start of my shift and it was after event hours. The sun was nearly fully set, so it was getting pretty dark. I see a woman with black hair, a white blouse and long skirt sitting on a boulder next to the water. I start walking up to her to inform her the place is off limits, but about 15 feet away I stop. I never understood the phrase frozen in fear until this moment. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my stomach churned, everything in my body told me not to get any closer. I couldn't do anything but stare at the back of this woman. I don't know how long I was standing there before one of the event coordinators came up behind me and said a brief goodbye and that all the staff/volunteers were gone for the night. I briefly looked to him and said okay and looked back. The woman was gone. I had a pretty clear view of both directions, so unless she hopped in the water I have no idea where she went. For the rest of the night I kept trying to walk over to the area the woman was sitting at, but every time panic and fear would build up inside me and I couldn't do it. The next night I had zero issues going over to that area and there was nothing out of the unusual. It was just that one night. To this day whenever I think of the event I get a bit shaky and fearful. I keep telling myself that my memory must be false and I looked away much longer. I was living with my friend during one summer. She told me that the old owner died in the house, and that his ghost would sometimes appear, so don't worry. I'm low-key terrified of things like ghosts, I don't like non-tangible problems, and she knew that, so I thought she was ducking with me. Still kinda scared though. One night I'm kinda sorta asleep, and I feel that being stared at feeling. I slowly open my eyes and there's this old guy standing over my bed staring down at me. There was something about him that made me sort of know he wasn't real. It was kind of like he was made of moonlight. Anyway, I didn't make eye contact and just slowly pulled the covers up over my head. I'm terrified, but passing it off as sleep paralysis until I feel the edge of the bed dip as if someone sat down. By this point I'm totally frozen and committed to playing dead and hoping it goes away. After what feels like an eternity I wake up in the morning sans old man. At breakfast I tell my friend about this crazy ass dream I had and she's like, oh. Did the guy look like? And Duckin described the old man to a T. Yeah, that's the old owner. Did not sleep comfortably in that house ever again. Back when I was 9 years old I lived in a house up on a mountain. This house was built on ancient Indian burial ground, so it was pretty haunted. We had a 2-story house and for the most part the rest of the house was pretty calm, but there was this one part of the house that was way worse than the rest, and that was the word shop and laundry room. My parents bred, raised, and sold English Mastiffs. These dogs were big and strong enough to scare off and tree a bear. But past this one point of the house they wouldn't dare go to after the sun went down. One night the power went out at our house for some reason, even though all the other neighbors had power. I remembered I had to pull my laundry out of the dryer for tomorrow, so I went ahead and grabbed a flashlight and my laundry basket. I went into the shop to get to the laundry room and something felt off. I looked behind me and saw that all 3 of the dogs were at the doorway and were refusing to go any further when I called them. Being young and not really caring, I went ahead without them. I then turned the corner to face the washer and dryer and shine the flashlight towards them, but between the appliances and me was a solid black mass hanging from the ceiling. At the point closest to the floor I saw nothing but a grin that was only a couple shades brighter than the rest of its form, and a little closer to the floor I saw 2 bright red eyes. Needless to say my laundry remained there with the flashlight on the floor till the next morning. And I'm almost positive that either that entity or another followed me and my family to the next house, because things that had a set spot would always be in a completely different room, or all the cupboards and drawers in the kitchen or bathroom would be open. And as we were moving out of that house we were wrapping up the packing, we only had a few boxes, cleaning supplies, and the last rites crucifix still hanging in the entryway. I was coming down the hall as my mom was walking underneath the cross. She got halfway across the room and I saw the cross fly off the wall and hit her in the back of the head. Shocked, we hurried up and finished. I went back in for the last box, and as I grabbed it I saw the broom that was in the corner of the kitchen fly from the kitchen to the dining room. I grabbed the box and forgot the broom. I figured the entity and next tenants or the landlord can keep it. When I was in college, I worked at a little gas station in the middle of nowhere, Alabama that was open pretty late. It was a great job because after 10, we really had no one that came in, so I could turn on music and work on my homework. One night, a little after midnight, I was getting ready to count down the register and pack up my things. I went to the back office, proceeded to start counting money when I noticed a heavyset guy standing at the counter, looking at the wall of cigarettes behind it. I figured I must have forgotten to lock the door, so I walk out to apologize, only to find that no one is there. I figure maybe the camera was not working, so I shrugged it off after I walked around the store, I also checked the door and it wasn't locked, so I locked it. I went back to the office, nothing on the camera screen, so I go back to counting down. A few minutes later, I look up at the screen again and the dude is still there, but now he is standing with his back to the camera pressed up against the beer fridge. I walk back out, now firmly shitting bricks as I was a tiny woman and far away from literally everything and everyone. No one was there. I was terrified, grabbed the can of wasp spray, and searched literally every inch of the store while trying to call my boyfriend at the time to drive out there. He was sadly too drunk to do so and said, "You're probably fine." Before hanging up, I summoned the remaining courage that I had and went back to the office, locking that door behind me as I did before. I hurried through counting everything again. Looking back up at the screen one more time, I saw the same dude, standing there and looking at the office door where I was. He was perfectly still, not moving but just standing there. I quickly finished counting the money down, threw it in the safe, and pretty much ran out of the store, not shutting off the lights behind me. The next morning, probably about 4 a.m., I was called by my boss asking me to open the store because he had a family emergency. The extra money was nice, so I agreed but asked if I could bring my friend with me since it would only be for an hour or two, and I told him what had happened the night before. "Oh, you saw him, huh? Yeah, go ahead. He scares me too." When I was a teenager in Riverside, California, my older brother and his friends used to visit the local cemeteries at night to be spooky goth kids, often picking up broken stones or fixing messes made by jerks along the way. This particular night it was him, my mom, me and I think 2 of his friends, could have been 3 of them. I was carrying my flip phone which had no service that I used as a clock, but its battery had died earlier in the day, so it was off and useless. This will be important information. We were walking through an older area with upright gravestones and I walked over a grave when my phone rang and lit up as though someone was calling. I stopped, pulled it out of my pocket and looked. It was lit up but no caller ID info showing. I walked forward to show my mom, and it stopped, went black and dead again. Okay, weird, but whatever. We tried to move a headstone that had been knocked over, but it was too heavy for the 5 or 6 of us to move, and when we started walking back the way we came, at what I think was the same area, it happened a second time. The second time everyone was together and saw it. It rang twice, lit up and then turned off suddenly. A few months after moving into a new house, I would complain to my parents daily about a scratching noise coming from the closest. Every night I'd hear it and every day I'd tell my parents. My mom slept with me one night and heard the scratching too. She told me years later that the night she spent in my room with me, she felt something grab at her leg, almost trying to pull her off the bed. I remember the nights after she slept in my room. We had a living room slumber party, lol, my mom's attempt at keeping me out of the room. So we all slept in the living room for a few days. I started to hear the scratching in the bathroom as I was brushing my teeth a few days later, and I called out to my mom that I was hearing the scratching again. She came into the room to comfort me, and as we left, we both noticed a cut on each of our foots, in the same position that had not been there before. We stayed with our grandma after that day and moved into a new house after that. Never went back to that house. I was so young at the time, I didn't really understand what was happening, but now I get it, lol. If my mom hadn't stayed in the room with me that night, who knows how long we would have lived there. My family moved to a different state right as I started high school. Our new house was only a couple of years old, on a beautiful lot with a golf course nearby, and it was the biggest house we'd ever lived in. I had my own bedroom and bathroom. Needless to say, I was super excited to live there. And the first night in my new room I was visited by the sleep paralysis demon. It was horrifying, because I'd never had a sleep paralysis episode before living there, but after moving in, and throughout the entire time I lived there, I suffered from sleep paralysis episodes like every single night I slept in that room. Just that room, though. If I fell asleep on the couch, I was fine. I also would see a particularly vicious shadow figure pretty much every time I turned off the lights in my room at night. I wish I could adequately describe the terror of this thing. You could just feel how it absolutely hated you, and wished you harm. Even when the lights were on, it was like it was always there, just hiding in the deepest shadows, just waiting for its chance to come out. So when there wasn't any light, I could see the shadow figure clearly standing in the corner, or in front of the window, or in the doorway. I had a mirror in my room, and that was the most unnerving place to see it in. I always kept a light on in my room, and it kept most of the nastiness away. But my little brother, whose bedroom was next door to mine, didn't have such luck. Unlike me, who really only got spooked at night, my brother's bedroom was legit haunted. It didn't matter what time of day it was, or if the lights were off or off, it was always frightening to go into that room. Even passing by the door was uncomfortable. Once you stepped inside, an unwelcoming chill enveloped you, and you felt like you were being watched by something evil. Like, honestly, truly, evil. Something so wretched and malicious that you just somehow knew if you were caught by this thing, you'd be hurt, or killed, or something worse. Like, if your soul had instincts, then they'd be screaming at you to run, and that's just how it felt to drop off laundry in the middle of the day. It was so much worse at night. Unlike me, who had a measly shadow figure to contend with, my brother had something actually manifest at night. I'm not really sure how to describe this entity: terrifying, vicious, mean, evil. It both had a form, but also didn't. It was like an embodiment of hatred and ill intention. Everyone in my family had encounters with this entity. My parents saw it right after we moved in, and they went in my brother's room to set up his bed. I would often catch glances of it when I passed his bedroom, and the door was ajar. My sister saw it when she went inside to help with chores. It was suffocating to be in my brother's room. My brother spent only a couple of nights in his room before moving in with my youngest brother. He only kept some clothes in there, otherwise, he never went inside. I have one for me and one for my grandmother. One night my grandmother was driving and she came upon an intersection. She had the right of way, so she was going to just keep driving, but suddenly a bright white figure darted in front of her, causing her to slam on the brakes. She was shocked and took a moment to look around for whatever did that, but nothing was there. Seconds later, an 18-wheeler came barreling through the intersection. If whatever figure did not dart in front of my grandmother's car, she would have likely been killed instantly by the 18-wheeler. My own story is on the scarier side of paranormal things. I was about 10 years old and I had just moved into a new room in the house. I was super happy to have a bigger room, but I had always avoided sleeping in it when it was a playroom for some reason. The first night I found out why. As I lay in bed that first night unable to fall asleep, I began to see some sort of figure standing in the corner of the room right near the light switch. It was a very vaguely humanoid shape, but that's all I could make out. I stared at it all night until I was finally exhausted enough to fall asleep. Over time I kept seeing the figure, always standing in the same spot, unmoving. As time would go on, the figure became more defined. After about 3 years of seeing this figure almost nightly in my room, I was able to see the figure clearly. She had a feminine figure, but was very tall. She had shoulder-length hair that was straight and fell over her face. She had abnormally long arms that reached down to her knees. Her fingers were long and sharp, almost as if they were blades, and they reached down to the floor. She had no color to her, just a mass of pure darkness. Most nights she would be staring into the corner. These nights I felt fine. I felt no bad emotions coming from her at all. Some nights she would be looking at me, but I could not see her eyes. These nights I would feel uneasy and struggle to sleep, but nothing really scary ever happened. When I was about 16 was when things got actually scary and borderline violent. One night when she was facing me, I caught a glimpse of her eyes. I froze up completely. Her eyes were piercing and pure blood red. What I felt that night was pure hatred and malice towards me. This was the first time since she started appearing where I couldn't sleep until I passed out from exhaustion. She didn't move at all, thankfully. After that night things changed. The shelf in her corner would always have things moved around. Sometimes she would wake me by throwing things from that shelf on the ground. Eventually she even tried throwing things directly at me, but she never left her corner. One night when I was 17 I saw her move for the first time. It was one of the bad nights where she would throw things at me. I woke up to a book hitting the wall dangerously close to me. I immediately looked to where she would stand and I saw her slowly but surely lifting her spindly arm to point at me with her blade-like fingers. The emotions I felt in that moment were all over the place. Fear, anger, sadness, malice, and all sorts of negativity. It overwhelmed me to the point of passing out. When I woke up after that it was still dark, and the negativity was just as intense. That's when I noticed she had moved from the corner entirely. She was standing above me at the side of my bed. I tried everything from screaming to running away to punching at her, but I could not move. All I could manage to do was cry. I don't remember how I got out of that situation. The next week, I slept on the couch in the living room. I tried to go back to sleep in my room after a week. She was still there. She never got that intense again after that night. Eventually I went away to college, but when I came back home for breaks she was no longer there. I have not seen her since I turned 18. February 2019, Pinecrest, California. Just drove up the very snowy and scary Highway 108 at night. Absolutely no one was on the road. I was here for a Boy Scout ski trip in a place called Camp Sylvester. I am young. The thing to note here is that it is one of the snowiest years in California history, and Pinecrest is a good 5,600 feet above sea level. That means there was almost 8 feet of snowpack already there, plus about 4 inches or so that had been fluttering down on the drive up. Camp Sylvester has a snow plow come through and clear the main drives for people to get through every morning. I arrived at the camp at about 10 at night, with a couple other kids. We were the only ones at the camp from what I know. One of these kids decided that it would be funny to turn up the heat in the cabin we were in up into the 80s. Me and another kid couldn't sleep in the heat, so we quietly got jackets on and went for a walk around the camp. 2 a.m., when I opened the door, the 4 inches of powder was now over a foot, and it was snowing hard, no wind. It might have been in the single digits out there, but it was refreshing to be out of the heat. We walked around a little, but we got spooked when a tree snow bombed in the distance. When the leaves give way and a lot of snow falls, so we headed to the camp's Gibson Hall, where there were a couple snacks lying around that we took advantage of. Around then was when the snow started pouring like rain. Scary starts here. The kid that I was with looked out the window of the hall towards our cabin, and got scared, because he saw someone. Spoiler, it was another kid taking a piss in the snow, but it scared us both and we went back to the cabin, now with even more snow on the ground, maybe just about 2 feet of powder. I realized that I needed to go to the bathroom, so I left trudging through the snow towards the lower camp restroom. I looked into the woods, and got a wave of anxiety. I saw something that I've never seen before, actual pitch black in the woods, only the light of the Gibson Hall and the bathroom hardly reaching me. I wanted to get this over with as quick as possible now, but the snow was stopping me. Note that I wasn't scared of being jumped by some Bigfoot creature at this point, just really anxious. When I got to the bathroom, I was not having it. Close quarters, old, probably silverfish infested bathroom, but I let it rip in the urinal, not without looking over my shoulder in the process. When I went to wash my hands, I heard a voice call my name from outside the bathroom. I jumped, but I went to check because I thought I knew that it was the kid I was hanging out with just a minute ago. I opened the door and saw nothing. Wait, that didn't sound like that kid at all. I threw myself off of the porch of the bathroom back to the cabin and high-kneed through the snow. Literally the definition of a fight or flight reflex. Your boy literally flew into the cabin with no regard for the people inside sleeping. I then curled up into my sleeping bag and watched Indiana Jones 2 times until the sun came out. By the end of the night there had been nearly 3 feet of snow. I told everyone what happened and they all seemed kinda spooked, because we were the only people in the camp. The Camp Sylvester bathrooms will forever scare me. This is actually serious. My granddad used to live in a cottage which had something in it. Cliché things would happen, the piano would play random keys at night, the decorative plates would move, the cat would hiss randomly at the same spots in the house act. The strangest thing was a door in between the master bedroom and the small box room off that, my room whenever I stayed there. For some reason the door in between the 2 rooms would always be open in the morning. Now, my granddad and grandma were quite private people and liked to have that door shut when I would stay. My granddad would always tell me off for opening it in the night, even though I swear I hadn't. So one night we talked about it and I suggested putting something in front of the door so it couldn't open easily. Great. Good idea. So my granddad took some books and stacked them in front of the door so it couldn't open easily, or not without making a lot of noise anyway, said goodnight to me and off to bed we went. Next morning, the books are still stood up, but the door's open. We were obviously freaked out. Next night granddad done the same, books in front of the door, off to bed. In the morning, all of the books were knocked over, some even in different rooms of the house and some in the shed at the end of the garden 50 meters away. After my grandparents had moved out, they found some records in a local church about the house. Apparently a girl had been pushed down the stairs by her mother and died. They believed this is what was causing things to happen. The husband of couple that moved in after them had a heart attack 3 weeks after moving in after being supposedly happy and healthy. Worked at a 90-yo bookstore. 2 months into working there the long-time owners had decided to retire, but soon after the assistant manager chose to keep the place open despite the long-time owners having sold off 90% of the stock. The assistant manager hired family and friends and kept half the old staff including me. A few months in, one of the friends she hired, who ran our computers after we closed at 9 p.m. said a man would appear on the basement stairs at 10 p.m., would walk to the back of the store, climb the stairs to the loft office, and disappear. The assistant manager took this story with a grain of salt as she was religious and didn't believe in the paranormal. But then family she hired started staying late and they started seeing the guy too. Eventually the assistant manager stayed late and said she saw him too. 6 months into the assistant manager running the place, a lady showed up with old pics of the store from the 50s, saying she'd worked there in the 60s. I asked her if she'd ever seen the ghost. I worked for him. She told us the ghost was the owner from the 60s. In his time the store closed at 10 p.m. and he would go around looking for last-minute customers before heading up to the office. Meanwhile, I always had the morning shift. I'd started coming in before sunrise because we had someone stealing all our newspapers off our front porch. I would go inside and wait in the near dark for the newspaper truck to drop them off. It was a few days after hearing the story about the old manager. I just brought in the papers and was hankering for donuts from a nearby shop. As I'm about to leave, I turned back towards the darkness and said, "Going to the donut shop. Want anything?" I didn't hear a voice, but the words "bear claw" popped into my head. I ran for the door, getting the creepy feeling that if I stuck around for one more second I really would hear a voice say "bear claw." I've never experienced anything paranormal myself, but my family has plenty of stories. This one took place sometime during the mid-1950s. My grandma came from a very poor family in Mexico. Her house was more like a shack, dirt took the place of carpet on the floor, etc. Every morning my great-grandmother would send her two oldest daughters, my grandma as the third born, to go to the woods and collect water from the river to bring back so the family could use it for washing, drinking or cooking. The second sister didn't tag along this particular morning, so it was up to the oldest sister to do the honor. The walk to the river was about 2 miles or so. She gets there and sees a long black-haired girl playing with a stick, tapping it against the flowing water. The girl had her back to my grandma's sister. She didn't see too many people come to the area, so she tried striking up a conversation with the girl. The girl doesn't answer her or even turn her back to acknowledge her. My grandma's sister shrugs it off and approaches the river to collect the water. When she got closer to the girl turns around slowly to face my grandma's sister, and my grandma's sister immediately sees that the girl has no face. Just skin replacing the eyes, the nose and the lips. She didn't really have a chin either, it was sort of just rounded off. Immediately, my grandma's sister dropped the bucket and fled the scene, running the whole 2 miles. She refused to ever do that chore again. My good friend is Native American and she dealing with historical trauma. She was trying to process the pain through writing, with a goal of someday maybe publishing her work. I was at her house trying to help her. I am not Native, and I had never had any kind of experience in trying to help with this kind of thing. But I'm a fair editor, so the hope was that I could help her get notes into a coherent essay. I was standing with my back to her glass patio door. She was a few feet away writing on her whiteboard. I'm trying to articulate her notes into sentences when suddenly, I feel an urgent, pulsing, pressure, pushing on the back of my head and all down my back. The pushes were going through my body, back to front. At the same time, I'm having like an out-of-body experience where I can see like several spirits, all connected, but distinct people, just pushing through me. The hair on my arm stood up and I was frozen in fear. It was over in seconds, but it messed me up. She said she felt something too, but for her it was a welcome sign. For me, I was just scared and got out of there as quickly as I could. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to bring myself to try to continue helping her. Also, I had several intense dark nightmares after that. I was driving alone back home through a neighborhood that is a bit of a shortcut to get to the main road I needed. It was probably around 11 p.m. and I was sober and wasn't tired after drinking a Red Bull a little later in the day than usual. I stopped at a stop sign to turn left and drive up the hill towards the main road. As I pushed on the gas and started to turn my wheel, an extremely clear and unmistakable pair of foggy/translucent legs from the hips down took about 3 or 4 steps across the crosswalk right in front of me. I pumped the brakes as soon as possible out of instinct, thinking someone was just out for a walk at night for a split second. But as soon as I came to a complete stop, I knew that what I saw wasn't an actual person at all. I stayed stopped right there in the intersection for a solid 10 seconds while my heart was racing and let out an audible "what in the duck?" I don't remember driving the rest of the 5 minutes home, probably from adrenaline. I'm not a superstitious person and don't necessarily believe in ghosts or spirits, but I know that what I saw that night was abnormal. It's my only personal experience so far, but can remember it like it was yesterday. That was probably 12 years ago now, and every time I have passed through that intersection it reminds me of what I saw. My wife has always had paranormal things happen to her, but her best story takes place at her aunt's house, which was built in the late 1800s. The basement has 2 completely walled-off bedrooms with no windows or HVAC, and she was staying in one of them. She did a study abroad program in Tokyo and bought some scrolls from a street vendor with miscellaneous kanji written on it. These art pieces were eventually mounted onto the bedroom wall in said basement. One night she comes home after clubbing around 2:30 a.m., gets an eerie feeling, and the scroll begins swinging like a pendulum back and forth. She freaks out and rips it off the wall and throws it away. Every time she tells the story, her dad or some other family member tries to rationalize it. Oh, it was an earthquake or maybe a fan blew, but as I said, there was no HVAC. I believe her to this day. My mom told me this story when I was younger, but now refuses to talk about it. This was before I was born. My sister was a newborn at the time and my mom stayed home for a while after mat leave while my dad worked. She was new to Canada and eager to make friends and eventually got to know our neighbors who had a 7-year-old girl. My mom would often invite her over for ice cream to the point it became a reoccurring thing after school. Unfortunately, the kid got in an accident and passed away. Time kind of passed until one day my mom heard the door knock. She peeped through the door hole and shockingly saw the little girl. Out of panic, she kind of stumbled backwards with no words coming out of her mouth. Frozen, the little girl asks if she can come in for ice cream. My mom claims she told the little girl to go away. And that she wasn't real. The little girl persisted, this time knocking harder on the door. The knocks got harder and harder, eventually turning into thundering smashes. The door frame was shaking and the door itself looked like it was about to be split. Suddenly, everything stops. It's dead quiet and everything is calm and motionless. That's when, my mom claims was the most evil, roaring and terrifying voice belted out, "Let me in."